Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's program. My name is Lydia Gordon, and I am a co-curator of the exhibition, The Salem Witch Trials, Reckoning and Reclaiming, along with my esteemed colleagues, Dan Lipkin and Paula Richter. Tonight's program, Major Arcana Witchcraft Today, is going to be an amazing conversation with one of the exhibiting artists in the exhibition and two panelists and collaborators on her project. So before we begin the hour-long conversation, I do want to communicate that the Peabody Essex Museum respectfully acknowledges that we are on the ancestral territory of the Pawtucket, Pennacook, Nomkig, Massachusetts, and Wampanoag peoples. Many other indigenous communities have lived and moved through this place over hundreds of generations, and indigenous people from many nations live and work in this region today. Please join us in honoring their communities, their elders, past and present, as well as future generations. So the outline of tonight's program, we will hear first from Frances F. Denny. Frances is an exhibiting artist in the exhibition. She is an artist whose work investigates female identities. Her work is represented by ClampArt in New York City. Frances's first monograph, Let Virtue Be Your Guide, was published in 2016 by Radius Books. Her second book, Major Arcana, Portraits of Witches in America, was released in November 2020 by Andrews McMeel Publishing. She is the recipient of a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship Award, and she has won numerous awards. She received her MFA from RISD, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Elle, Cherry Bombe, Architectural Digest, and she lives in New York. I would also like to introduce our second panelist, Melissa Madara. Melissa J. Madara is a witch, herbalist, chef, and storyteller. They are the author of the upcoming magical cookbook, which drops very soon, The Witch's Feast, as well as a co-owner of Catland Books and editrix of Catland's in-house magazine. As an occultist, Melissa's work and research deals primarily with ancient religions of Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean coast, divination, herbal magic, and work with poisonous plants. You can follow Melissa and all of their great research on Instagram at saint.jane. And our other incredible panelist that is joining us tonight in this conversation about contemporary witchcraft and what a witch means today is the owner and founder of House Witch, Erica Feldmann. Erica has been using intuition to heal spaces from a very young age. A Chicago native, Erica moved to Salem in 2010 to study witches and the sacred feminine in the Gender and Cultural Studies graduate program at Simmons College. The knowledge she gained there, combined with her innate talents with interiors, came together to form House Witch, a company devoted to helping people heal their spaces and love their homes. Decorating her clients' homes on shoestring budgets really taught her about the challenges people confront in their homes and habitats. So when House Witch opened in 2015, the shop is absolutely a manifestation of her dream that all people should have a little magic in their homes. So Erica now lives in downtown Salem in a magical house with her two cats and her wife, and is a beloved friend of the Peabody Essex Museum. So the outline for the program tonight is that we will hear from Frances first, a little bit about her project that's featured in the exhibition. And then we'll hear from both Erica and Melissa about their practices and their connection and ideas around contemporary witchcraft today. So, Frances, are you there?
Hi, I'm here. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Frances. Thanks so much for joining and being like an unbelievable artist and collaborator on the exhibition and then this program. So if folks haven't made it to Salem yet, first of all, the exhibition is up until March, so everyone has some time, right? But can you tell us a little bit about what is Major Arcana and how did you come to this project?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you, Lydia, for the introduction, and thank you to the Peabody Essex Museum for the show and for hosting tonight. It's such an honor to be in this Zoom room with all of you. So why don't we go to my first slide, because I want to back up for a moment. It's actually the next slide, Mark. So I want to back up to some of the kind of foundations or underpinnings of my work in general as an artist, which, as Lydia mentioned, really is investigating the development of female identity and selfhood. So this image is a picture of a sculpture by Janine Antoni. It's called Umbilical. And I'll never forget the first time I laid eyes on this sculpture. It's about 12 inches long. It's a cast of that the artist made of her own mouth, which is on the left of the sculpture, and her mother's hand, and they're connected by this spoon, this silver spoon. So for me, this sculpture perfectly encapsulates a sense of kind of matrilineal or familial inheritance. It asks, what is passed down or absorbed or inherited? And, to what extent do those things affect the formation of a sense of personal identity? So when I saw this sculpture at the time, I was documenting and photographing in New England, and this New England world that I grew up in Brookline, Mass. And I was thinking about the ways in which identity is formed by our family and where we come from. We can go to the next slide. So I also came upon this Colonial Girls embroidery sampler. It's by a girl named Cynthia Burr, who was born in 1770. You can actually see that it's stitched into the sampler itself. So samplers, for those of you who don't know, were used as didactic kind of learning tools. It was a place where girls could learn the decorative arts, right? You'll notice the delicate floral decorations and depictions of domestic scenes, but they also could learn their ABCs, and you'll see at the top there, ABCD, right, the ABCs. In addition to that, bits of scripture were often incorporated. And you'll see under the ABCs, it says, "Let virtue be a guide to thee." So it's all of which is to say this piece is extolling, it's hammering in a sense of traditional feminine virtue. It's defining it for us, right? And to me, it really represents a kind of inherited primer of how to be a good woman, right? We can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a picture of the fold out detail in my first book, and it's a reproduction of my grandmother's wedding portrait. And I find it so revealing that her actual picture, I hope you can see this in the slide, is on either end of this huge panoramic shot of a very fancy wedding tent, which is very, front and center. In other words, the trappings and performance of feminine virtue is on full display and are in fact sort of given more visual weight than the person herself or the people, whose wedding it is. I mean, the fact that my grandmother doesn't look very happy in her portrait is almost besides the point, right? We can go to the next slide. So as artists are wont to do, I borrowed the verse of scripture from Cynthia Burr's sampler for the title of my book. And in this book, I photographed many of my female relatives, as well as the domestic spaces that they occupy, as a way to kind of come to terms with this version of femininity and to trace the ways in which those ideals are shifting across generations. Okay, next slide. So you're probably wondering at this point how I got from virtue to witches. So during my research process for Let Virtue Be Your Guide, I made this strange discovery about two people in my family tree. So the first is Mary Bliss Parsons, who was my 8th great grandmother. This was a woman who was accused of witchcraft, and this was in Northampton, Massachusetts, about 20 years prior to the Salem Witch Trials. So not exactly at the same moment as the next ancestor, but in the mix, right? So Mary was the wife of a merchant. She was mother to, I think, 11 children, and was the envy of many in her community. In fact, it was somebody in her community who accused her of witchcraft. She was brought to trial in Boston and eventually acquitted, but her reputation was tarnished forever. We can go to the next slide. That's her house in Northampton that's still standing. So in my research, I also discovered that my 10th great grandfather, Samuel Sewell, was one of the central judges in the Salem Witch Trials. So that coincidence, right, that I am the descendant of both the kind of oppressor figure and the oppressed figure in this particular moment and place in time, struck me as a significant coincidence. And I couldn't reconcile it at the time, and frankly, don't think that I ever will. But it also struck me as a very kind of sticky, thorny, juicy thing that I might want to work with in the future. So I kind of tucked it away. I finished that book, and we can go to the next slide. And then in 2016, several years later, I was reminded of that ancestral coincidence when I was reading Stacy Schiff's wonderful account of the Salem Witch Trials. You'll see it on the right in this picture. Because of course, one of the main sort of characters in her account is my ancestor, Samuel Sewell. Pem also has a portrait of Sam Sewell. So I began thinking about the witch as a historical scapegoat, as an archetype, but also as a contemporary identity that actually I knew very, very little about at the time. And so from there, the seed for what became Major Arcana was really sown. Like I said, I didn't know a thing about modern witchcraft. And so I set out to learn as much as I could before I even took out my camera. And these are some of the books that I found the most useful in getting the lay of the land and kind of learning some of the language surrounding witchcraft. Okay, we can go to the next slide. There we go. So I spent about 3 years exploring witchcraft across America and photographed around 75 individuals for the project. After doing so, I can tell you with a lot of certainty that a witch is not one thing. It's a highly individualized, self-defined identity. Each person I photographed embodies a different kind of witchcraft, whether or not it's aligned with a religion like Wicca or Voodoo, or is a self-defined practice. And of course, like Wicca, for example, can have like very strict rituals and parameters, but even there are many sects of Wicca, right? So many of my subjects consider themselves pagan or neo-pagan, many do not. There are those who practice mysticism or engage with the occult. You have politically oriented activist witches, polytheists who work with a pantheon of goddesses, tarot readers, astrologers, people who are practicing spellcraft, and quite a few green witches or plant-based healers. So it's really such an individualized, malleable identity, which is what I like so much about it. You know, it's not a neat prescribed box that someone needs to sort of shoehorn their way into. And I would just like to take a second to acknowledge that I do use the words female and woman mostly when I'm talking about witches, and that's largely because of historical association of witches with womanhood. However, within Major Arcana, I took care to include a spectrum of female, trans, genderqueer, and non-binary individuals. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So I think, you know, people often will ask me, so like, well, if witchcraft is all these different things, like, what is it? And I don't have a neat answer, but I do think ultimately that even though it is hard to make these neat generalizations about witchcraft, at its very essence, it's about the cultivation of an inner power or resilience. It's about being in tune with oneself and with the earth, actually, too. Or maybe it's for finding alternative systems for processing the world around us. So I'm gonna, I'm just so thrilled to have a selection of these portraits at the Peabody Essex Museum as part of this show, and I hope that you'll all get a chance to see it in person soon. We'll take questions at the end, but I'm excited to now pass things off to two of my subjects from Major Arcana, Erica Feldmann and Melissa Madara. So let's start with you, Erica. Can you tell me a little bit about what this wonderfully murky word witch means to you personally? Like, how did you come to witchcraft, and what does your practice entail?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Thank you for including me in this project, Francis, and happy Scorpio new moon to everyone. We definitely don't have the like hours, days, weeks, months that it would take me to talk about what the word witch means to me, but I can tell you in the context of my own life that I think I was just born with a very like innate curiosity about, you know, I am a Scorpio rising, so like an innate curiosity about what is sort of hidden or considered to be sort of dark or shadowy, and was very drawn to, you know, witchy type stuff. Again, like from as far back as I can remember, you know, witchy movies were my favorite when I was a kid. And, you know, in my family, we were sort of casual witches where, you know, there wasn't anybody practicing a religion or necessarily like casting spells, but my grandfather, my maternal grandfather would say, you know, that he was a witch and tell us stories about, you know, different things that he sort of felt like he manifested or made happen. So it wasn't really a taboo in my family at all. And my parents were pretty good about letting me explore things on my own. And by the time the movie The Craft came out and I was 14 and an angsty teen, you know, looking to identify with something and not really finding that sort of in, you know, pop culture or like tween culture. And then The Craft happened. And I remember I saw it on opening night in the theater when I was 14. And it just really touched on something for me. It, you know, kind of brought together sort of like an aesthetics piece to all of this that I resonated with very much. And, you know, I think just the empowerment, but also like the community. I mean, you know, it's not perfect in that movie, obviously, but there is, you know, female camaraderie and, you know, this sense of like, we have power and we can do things, and we're outsiders, but we're owning that. And I think that message really resonated with me. But ultimately, you know, the kind of Wicca that I could like learn from the shelves of Barnes and Noble was a little bit limiting for me, and just organized religion in general isn't really for me. And so I sort of fell away from it. Again, other than the sort of like casual witchcraft that we practiced in my family. But I fell away for a while. And then it wasn't until I was about to graduate college with my degree in history, and I did a summer program at Cambridge University in England and took a class called Witchcraft in Early Modern England. And it was there that I realized that sort of all of these threads of my life, this sort of interest in the occult and history and feminism and archetypes and the collective unconscious, like all kind of came together in this container of witches and witchcraft. And so I decided to go move to Salem and go to Simmons College and get my master's degree in gender and cultural studies. And, you know, so I just started looking at, you know, the archetype of the witch from every different direction. That program at Simmons is really great and interdisciplinary. And so I took, you know, history classes and media studies classes and cultural theory classes. And, you know, throughout all of this, looking at, you know, how we've created the witch, what is historically a witch, you know, do they actually exist outside of, you know, people's projections? And so by the time I opened my own witch store, which I can't even tell you I mean, that was never even in my wildest dreams or imagination. But when the opportunity sort of presented itself, it definitely felt, magical in this way that I think maybe people, only people who practice witchcraft can understand. And it felt extremely validating, and it kind of taught me that magic is real. And if I didn't already have that sense before, and so that's how I got here. And then, now at this point in my life, my practice is almost like too big to see around. It is just so kind of like incorporated into my life and my values. But I live very intentionally, and I follow the moon phases, and I consult different divinatory practices, and I do all of those things that people would think are witchy, and I don't even know that I even notice them anymore. But and my cats are my best friends. So that's me as a witch and how I became a witch. And again, I mean, I think that it's such a wonderfully messy term, because it can mean so many different things, but I love all of them.
Hi, everybody. I'm Melissa Madara, and I want to kind of pick up with that same question because I think it's a really nice and juicy one. And Mark, if you just want to cycle through, I don't have too many slides, but if you want to cycle through them as I'm going, just feel free to click through. But this question of what the word witch means is one that I tackle pretty frequently. I can't tell you guys how often in my career I've been asked this question. And if I'm being honest, I can't say that I've actually given the same answer twice too frequently. And that's because, as you said, it is a term that defies definition, defies containment in a lot of ways. Not just here in the present time where the word is coming to all of us with, all of its good and bad historical context, but also, even throughout the kind of meandering history of magic. It's a term that's always very much at the edge of the definable, and it kind of walks between two worlds, that of the natural and that of the supernatural. Witchcraft, the doing of being a witch, is also never been one thing, one monolith, one image we can point to and say that is for certain a witch. Historically, what a witch is going to change depending upon what time period, what region, what culture, what religious context we're speaking to. So to claim that word as an identity now, here in the present moment, which I do, and I think a couple of us here on the panel do, one of the only things that necessarily comes with that is a resistance to definability, almost with this archetype of like the arch transgressor, the rebel, the revolutionary, as a figure who exists on the fringes of what is known and sort of on the edges of the describable world, and not just inhabits those edges, but seeks to tear those fringes down. And that's the case whether we're talking about the adversarial traditional witches of Europe or cunning folk who are picking up the roles of doctor and spiritual leader within their communities, or even modern feminists who are reviving this term and weaponizing it now against the patriarchy. So these themes of destroying oppressive social structures and destroying dogmas and kindling this kind of feral fire against human complacency are some of the themes that I think are really cornerstones in understanding the witch identity in the here and now. As for my personal practice, I'm kind of tight-lipped about that. And this is choice that comes from that same ideology against the human urge to define the undefinable. But magic is something that I came into in my childhood, the way that I think a lot of young femmes do and sort of flirt with when they're young. My mom, who's actually in the Zoom room tonight, hi mommy, was a tarot reader and a medium. So many of my early experiences with the world of magic were through her and were experienced through her. And certainly, I had the world crush that spark in me through my teens and my early 20s, as many of us have had. You flirt with magic and you experience it directly when you're young and innocent and exploring the world with fresh eyes, and then things die back, and it happens to many of us. But as a serious practitioner, I did come back to magic in my early 20s through tarot and through mythology and through occult herbalism and concepts of animism. And my practice now looks very, very different than what I think I would have imagined myself as a fully formed witch looking like back then. you can describe my religious and magical work as being part of Hellenic faith, so operating within the Greek magical system, very, very influenced by magical systems that come from the Mediterranean coast in general. That's where my homeland, Croatia, is from. Not my homeland, I'm like second generation, but still, where my ancestral land is from. And my practice is very influenced by the grimoires, very influenced by something that I call folk Satanism, which is a conversation for another day. But I lean very much towards an experimental praxis that tries to look at magic and figure out how it works and break it down into its operative parts in a very sort of like chaos magic perspective. So like hard to describe the work that I do. And I'm sure, Frances, in all of your interviews with people, that's something that you discovered through talking to people, is that it is difficult to describe. It is undefinable and undescribable in very many ways. But that's sort of like the two bits on what it is that I do. So yeah. Pass back to you, Frances.
Thank you both so much. And yes, absolutely. You said there was this, resistance to definability, Melissa, and you're right. And I think that that's something I really tried to capture in my pictures, right? I'm trying to use this project as a way in for people without trying to define anything too neatly, because I definitely cannot do that. Okay, so why don't Melissa and Erica, why don't you turn your cameras on and unmute and we can chat. I have a few questions for all of us to talk through. And I guess I would start by saying, in my research for Major Arcana, it was hard, especially early on before I had gotten the lay of the land, it was hard to find centralized places to learn about witchcraft. There is no witchcraft university. And I found that spaces like Catland and House Witch were offering much more than just a place to buy, pretty crystals and candles. Anytime I went to a new town or city for this project, I would stop by the local apothecary or botanica or occult shop. And these, I really found that these kinds of spaces are where discoveries happen and where curiosities are sated or piqued, and where I would argue countercultural communities are organizing. So I want to ask you both, how do you see your shops as community spaces or hubs for learning? Do you find that people come in kind of in search of something? Melissa, let's go to you first, and then we'll hear from Erica.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I like to think of Catland as a community hub. I hope we're worthy of a title like that because, cultivating and serving our community is a deeply guiding principle that it influences all that we do really at the shop. And I think in this question, you touch on something kind of neat, which is that one of the main differences between the witchcraft renaissance that we're having right now, or the witch wave, like Pam Grossman says, is that, and the difference between that and you say what we saw in the 90s or the 70s or the 1920s when we've had these sort of occult resurgences in the past, is that we have this surplus of publicly available information on what magic is now. And how to gain entry into that world that we haven't had in past decades. And not all of that information is good, but we're very blessed in the present moment that the occult, which is by its very definition, something that's very hidden and hard to access, is now largely being uncovered and demystified. And I like to think that a good portion of the work that we do at Catland is helping people to navigate the amount of information that exists on this subject and the variety of subjects that are associated. A lot of folks who find their way to Catland are looking for guidance in how to source their entry point into the witch world. And that's natural. It's a world that's designed to keep looky-loos and tourists and people who are uncertain of what they want out of our space. And I think that one of the greatest community services that we offer at the shop in spaces like ours is, I think, to patiently connect with folks and to connect them with resources that will actually assist them, to hear them, whether that's over the counter or in a tarot reading or in a spell work consultation, or in the questions that I get as an educator during one of my classes, and continue that demystification work by connecting folks with resources and books and articles and other teachers who can really actually help them down their path. It's almost a rebellion against this kind of contemporary guru culture that we've seen sort of spring up in the last 15, 20 years, maybe because we all sort of grew up in this like spiritual vacuum of new atheism and we're all sort of looking for someone to point us the way. Who knows? But you know, where guru culture says you should find an enlightened, smart person and believe them wholesale and allow them to lead you wholesale and give them all your money. What we try to do at Catland is to encourage intellectual curiosity about these subjects and to have people actually consider what it is they want to get out of magic. And while we try not to ever really give someone directions outright to places that they don't know that they want to go, like to tell someone what their practice should be, my job as a cult librarian and community leader is to make sure that our community has resources and it has people who are encouraging our community to think for themselves, you know, high quality educators and safe spaces to ask questions. Otherwise, we slip back into the murk, into the occultness of the occult, which mostly serves to help people get ripped off and help sell a lot of really bad, very fraudulent books. So, you know, this whole large current of demystification in our occult renaissance is so important for making sure that we're learning with integrity and that we're like learning authentic information. And as a community space, that's one of the biggest standards that I hold myself to. Cool.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about being in Salem is that people that come into my store are already sort of primed for like witch stuff, you know? And I mean, I love that as an opportunity to sneak in some anti-capitalism, to sneak in some radical feminism, because, you know, there's a lot of different witch stores in town. And for me, it is important, you know, everything that Melissa is saying is exactly totally right. And I relate to as well. And I just think having the opportunity to, I mean, first of all, like people come, they're looking for magic. I mean, they're looking for something beyond the mundane of their life. They're looking for, you know, again, like Melissa was saying earlier, like this kind of childhood idea of like there's got to be more than this, right? And so we give them that, you know, because we, you know, the staff here, whether we're giving our time in person or whether we're, you know, writing articles for our community page, which is a huge resource of free spells and rituals and, you know, horoscopes and taroscopes and tarot spreads and all sorts of stuff, because we want people to know that like this doesn't have to be separate from your life. I mean, I think that's kind of my project is like this can be woven into your life effortlessly and can show you so much about your own personal power and give you power to make your life look like whatever you want it to look like. And I think people need reminders of that, you know? And so, you know, we're very intentional with how we merchandise in the shop to, you know, put everyday items like, you know, hand soap or body wash or something right next to a tarot deck, because, you know, I pull a tarot card every morning. It's part of my own morning routine, you know, and it can be part of yours too. And it takes 5 minutes and boop, there's some magic in your life to, you know, bring you out of this, you know, mundane kind of existence that, you know, a lot of people are kind of mired in. And so it's really a privilege and a thrill to be able to do that and to watch people shift and to watch people interact with different things in the store. You know, whether it's an apron that says "Smash the Garlic and the Patriarchy," or Virgie Tovar's book, "You Have the Right to Remain Fat," or you know, just all these different things that, you know, we stock here that make people stop and start asking some questions that maybe they've never asked, and to see some possibilities and some opportunities in their life that maybe they haven't seen before, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you both. There's so many things I want to like interject. I feel like we could have a conversation about each one of these questions, but for the sake of time, I'm going to push on. So I want to talk for a minute about gatekeeping and representational justice. You know, as a white woman in a position of privilege, I'm sensitive to how I could be kind of colonizing the witchcraft space with my camera. So I've taken a lot of care in how I've chosen to represent my subjects and give them as much agency in their own representation as possible. You know, the tricky thing about a photographic portrait, and I talk about this a lot, is that it's fundamentally a reductive act, right? It's taking a three-dimensional, complicated, living, breathing, dimensional, undefinable human being and reducing them into one static dimension. So I think, you know, that's a lot to work against with a photograph. Of course, I also believe in the expansiveness and magic of photography, but that's a separate conversation as well. So in any case, there is a lot to work with when you're making a photographic portrait, and combine that with the ways in which marginalized communities have been depicted by photography historically, it becomes extremely thorny territory. So, like I said, I'm working to give my subjects as much agency as I could when I was sort of defining the parameters of their portrait sessions. For example, I would always ask people to decide where they wanted to be photographed. You know, would it be in their home? Would it be out in a park, in a forest? And they would choose what they would wear and what they would bring to their shoot as well. The idea was that these choices would sort of reflect something about their identity, about their witchcraft. And then really importantly, I was so thrilled that over 2/3 of my subjects agreed to contribute their voices to the book and to the show. So you'll see in the show, there are short essays written by my subjects next to their portrait. So that was a very important component of the project for me. So to turn this back to you two, I'm curious, you know, as shop owners and cultural curators, in a sense, you know, how do you bring awareness to this idea of gatekeeping and representational justice? You know, what are some of the ways you've worked to avoid things like cultural appropriation, which I know is a very hot topic in the witch world, or, you know, a kind of general sort of colonialist sensibility? So, Erica, let's go back to you.
Okay, sure. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's two different kind of questions here as far as I understand it, but you know, the cultural appropriation piece is so awesome as a place for people to really start to unpack their privileges and you know, all of the different intersections of identity and what we colonize and what we claim for our own. And you know, I don't try to hide that I had problematic practices like woven into House Witch in the beginning because I just didn't know. And so I've tried to make the sort of journey around, you know, stopping selling things like white sage because I wasn't finding any that was being ethically sourced by, you know, indigenous people. Palo Santo, same thing. But you know, at the same time, talking about that again on our community page and on Instagram, and not just saying like, well, it's wrong, and not giving any explanation or not copping to the fact that I didn't even know it was wrong when I opened the store. You know, I'm a person that has to learn things too. And so as a shop owner and someone with a platform, I have found it to be an incredible, like, you know, thread to keep following to, you know, for my own personal, you know, knowledge and experience, but also as a way of showing my customers and my followers, like, hey, it's okay to learn things. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to learn things. It's okay to like grow from those things. But, you know, nothing that you can do in witchcraft is going to be successful if it's disrespectful. You know, I mean, that's the antithesis of, I think, you know, what witchcraft kind of means to me, in terms of being in your power and empowering yourself and trying to make results either internally or externally. Well, if disrespect is part of that, and, you know, colonization is part of that, like, I don't think that's aligned with the, you know, sort of forces of the universe. That's just me. But, and then in terms of like gatekeeping, I mean, the way that I sort of understand the debate within this context in this community is sort of, you know, who gets to sort of spread these knowledges, and who is deemed worthy of that. And, you know, like I said earlier, I learned about witchcraft from the Wicca shelf at Barnes and Noble in Downers Grove, Illinois, and I would not be here if it weren't for that. And while maybe I don't resonate with that kind of material now, it was super impactful into the kind of person that I am. You know, a few years ago, and this is sort of a different situation, it's almost a gray area in between these two, where Sephora, you know, launched a kit, and it had, you know, problematic white sage and rose quartz, and kind of, you know, it was like the mass produced version of sort of what, you know, Melissa and I kind of do. And, you know, it's offensive in a lot of ways. And then there's the way in which it's like maybe somebody's very crucial entrance into witchcraft. Maybe it's like where some girl didn't spend $75 on makeup to make her feel like she's not good enough on her own, but she spent it on this thing that's gonna spark a lifelong interest in something that's incredibly validating for her and maybe incredibly impactful in her community, their community. So I think that gets a little bit trickier, you know, and I think ultimately, you know, what we always tell our customers, you know, sometimes they'll pick up a crystal and say, well, what am I supposed to do with this? And we say, what do you want to do with it? You know, and we just definitely encourage people to definitely like do their own research and learn what resonates with them, and really check in with what feels right and true and authentic to them. And that might not come from a source that I resonate with, or that I think is like, you know, qualified to teach people about things. But as long as it's not disrespectful, I say, you know, let the people engage, and the more witches, the better.
Thank you, Melissa.
Awesome. Yeah. Great question also, by the way, and one that goes really under discussed. This kind of work is so important to our mission at Catland. And I know, Frances, you know that very well, because in many ways, I feel like shops like ours are still undoing the damage and the colonization that witch shops perpetuated through the 70s and the 90s, and certainly in some cases into the present. We have, you know, for example, the rise of crystals as a multi-million-dollar retail industry in this country with no discussion of child enslavement or ethical sourcing. We have white sage pushed as an accessible cleansing panacea for white folks to just consume without any indigenous context or concern for environmental impact. We have authors who are becoming famous for decades for ripping off and rebranding indigenous spirituality. So it's not just the baseline amount of work that we should be doing as community curators to make sure we're getting it right in our responsibility to our community. You know, things like keeping a diverse staff and keeping a really, really diverse events calendar and stocking our library with books on a variety of different traditions. It's also our job to undo the decades and decades of damage that have been done by the occult commodities industry that is only kind of really being discussed now. You know, one of the things that we do at Catland is we donate 100% of our sales from white sage to indigenous organizations. We don't buy books, even popular ones, from authors who speak for traditions that they're not actively participating in. We don't educate, we don't just educate ourselves on industry pitfalls. We also make sure that our customers are educated on why they shouldn't be buying white sage if they're not indigenous, why they should be critical of the authors that they get their books from, why they need to be asking questions about how their products are sourced and how to make sure that their tools and their information is coming from a place of integrity. That's just like, that's how we take on the work of decolonizing the occult industry for our patrons. And that means that we have had to have uncomfortable conversations with our community before, both about holding ourselves accountable, of course, and also in shifting what people come to expect from us and come to expect from shops like ours, away from sort of the industry standard of providing tools without any sort of criticism or any sort of insight for the sake of pure profit, and towards what we hope is a new normal in social justice and the witchcraft industry at large, especially now that that's becoming more and more and more of a multi-million-dollar industry in this country. It's really important for us to be shifting that conversation toward a more critical lens. So that's part of how we do that stuff at Catland.
Thank you. Those were such terrific answers to that question. Again, so many things so many threads I want to pick up, but I think have time to go through one more question, and then probably we'll have to mosey into Q&A if there are any any questions. But so I just want to switch gears for a second and talk about Salem and this exhibition and the ways in which art can promote awareness or compassion. You know, one of my intentions for Major Arcana is that the subject matter, and saying this to you two, I'm not talking to you two when I'm saying like the intention is for it to be taken seriously, because you are taking it seriously. But it's all too common that when over the last 5 years now that I've been talking about this, that people like look at me like I'm crazy when I talk about witches, and I have to remind myself that the cultural touchstone that most people still have for the idea of a contemporary witch or just a witch period is really mainly still influenced by like fairy tales and Disney and the Wizard of Oz. So, for me, it is very gratifying to have these portraits and these voices on these hallowed walls, right? The museum space as an institution automatically invites serious consideration of the art that it curates for the public. So there's also a kind of like symbolic vindication here that Peabody Essex here in Salem and there in Salem is, putting on a show that celebrates the voices of people who have reclaimed this archetype for themselves in a town where historically people associated with that word were put to death. So that's so meaningful for me as an artist. And I bet my judge ancestor is probably rolling in his grave right now. I mean, at least I hope he is. But I want to ask both Melissa and Erica, and I imagine that your answers will be quite different because Melissa, you're in Brooklyn. By the way, that is where Catland is. I don't know if we made that clear. And Erica, as someone who's living in Salem and is a store owner in Salem, business owner, what does Salem mean to you both as a witch, as a person, as a business owner, and does the historical baggage of this archetype loom large for you? Are you over it? What does that baggage mean to you? Okay, let's go with Erica. Go ahead.
Well, coming out of, we're just a few days out of October here, which is like definitely, over 1 million people come to Salem in October. But I'm still not over it. I mean, for me, it is like just still so thrilling that people flock to, Witch City. It is, I didn't really know that much about the Salem Witch Trials when I first moved here. I mostly studied the European witch hunts and witch trials because that was more of, a really widespread sort of campaign on the part of the Christian church to, attach a particular kind of like evil to women and, take control over their bodies and their existences. And that was sort of the project that I was interested in. And Salem is such an outlier in that, within that context, and really all of the New England witch trials are. But so, what I appreciate about Salem is the container that it has become for modern witches, for, like I said, the celebration of the archetype of the witch. I feel like I definitely have, so much respect for Lori Cabot, who opened the first witch store here, who paved the way for all of this. you know, she's the one that kind of reclaimed this and got this whole ball rolling. And, you know, so for me, it's just to see like witches on the police cars, and the high school mascot is the witches, and, you know, there's witches painted on the parking spaces and stuff. And to somebody who's just a super fan of witches, like this is the place. And I think it's so cool. And, you know, I'm certainly glad that Salem obviously makes efforts to commemorate the victims of the trials and to contextualize all of this and to bring in incredible artists like you, Francis, to, you know, help interpret and help us suss out this, you know, really messy term. And so, you know, like you're saying, most people's point of reference is sort of the Wicked Witch, and, you know, definitely these like depictions of the witch all over Salem kind of align with that a little bit, you know, more. There's like the moon silhouette with the witch on the broomstick. And, but, you know, again, I think it kind of goes back to the gatekeeping thing, where I'm just sort of like, whatever brings people here, like whatever brings people to curiosity around witches and witchcraft, like that's where I think it's, you know, kind of our responsibility to then say, okay, you're here. Okay, here's what you should know. And here's what this can bring into your life, and here's what this can, you know, bring into your awareness. And I think Salem is just such a unique place. I describe it as a witchtopia, which is based on Foucault's term heterotopia, which is about sort of places that are containers for things that can't be held outside of it. And so I love it. And I think it's important. And I think there's so much energy here. And I think there's so much good energy here that makes up for, you know, the dark days. And I know that, you know, a lot of the witches here in town take that responsibility really seriously, and trying to create sort of a healed space here.
Melissa, go for it.
Yeah, you know, so being a native New Yorker and having always lived and done most of my magic here, I don't have a ton of like personal connection to Salem. I think I've only actually made it up there once, and it was the day after Halloween. So it was kind of like New Orleans after Mardi Gras, where there's just everyone's in recovery from the October that just happened. But I've done a bit of research on it for my book, and just also for my own personal research. And one of the things that I know is that there's some debate among historians about whether or not like actual practitioners of magic were part of the Salem witch trials, or whether this was just a political panic. So the story for me is a little bit more about this sort of theme of state violence against otherized members of the community. So with that in mind, the Salem witch trials for me as an outsider kind of exists as this symbol of resistance to unhelpful social dogma, to a violent history of oppression, to the pain of othering members of our community, and sort of the violent repercussions of that. And so to put that within the context of like the violence towards witches, or folks deemed to be witches, whether they're actual magical practitioners or not, throughout history, the historical baggage kind of makes the witch archetype a very useful one as a champion for the oppressed and for the marginalized here today. We definitely see that with the witch being taken up by the feminist cause. We definitely see the witch featuring prominently in this whole last year of protests that we've had here in the United States. So she's here as an archetype now to be our champion to all the things that crushed her in the past. And I want to hesitate to do what I think a lot of modern people coming to witchcraft now have done, which is to flatten the witch into sort of just the rebellious aspect of the archetype, because we can't separate out the spiritual side, right? And sort of the wisdom and the value that has in its own right. The witch isn't just the benevolent people's champion. You know, she hexes as much as she heals. And I think that this freedom from a moral binary is an important aspect of like understanding her. However, she certainly has been politicized as an outcast and as an untouchable time and time again, as a label that would condemn you, not just culturally or mythologically, but very much literally through mass murders like the witch trials, like we've seen throughout Europe, which still go on today in many parts of the world, something that also doesn't get talked about enough. So there's this acknowledgement within the witch identity now, with all of that historical baggage, that if you claim the name for yourself and you call yourself a witch, and you claim the identity of an outsider to an extent, you put yourself in an adversarial position to the status quo. And it's your opportunity, I want to say your invitation, to do something about that. There's also something to be said for a kinship between all of society's outcasts and outsiders, and all of us who don't sort of fit the mold that we're told that we're supposed to, whether that comes from alternative spirituality or gender identity or race or ability. Kinship here not meaning we're all facing the same level of danger and exclusion, because of course we're not, but kinship as in we understand that liberation for one is liberation for all of us, and that radicalizes many people who come to witchcraft now and who claim the identity of the witch into social justice and into spaces where they feel compelled to fight for all forms of or fight against all forms of exclusion and oppression when they see it in their community. So I feel like that's the way that historical baggage kind of informs us where we're at now with the witch as she exists today.
Thank you, both of you. That was such a terrific conversation. I feel like we could go on for another few hours, but I know that there are some questions. Lydia, how should we go about this? I'm going to let you ask questions.
I could just listen to the three of you talk for so much longer. This was so interesting, and we have so many comments and questions. And many of them are from folks that are interested in engaging in their own practice. And since we have some experts here, I thought I would, since we've gotten a couple, I thought I would just sort of bring a couple together and ask all three of you. People are interested in the literature that you're reading or that you introduced to people. So Frances, I know that you showed us some books, but if all three of you want to share a text that is incredibly inspiring, or where you started, I think folks would be really interested in that. And then also, what are some tools or resources, especially from your own shops, please promote, where people can find you to learn more about their own engagement with witchcraft today?
I'm happy to go first quickly. So I did show a couple of books earlier on the slideshow, and if I had to point to two that were really essential to me, one would be Margot Adler's book, Drawing Down the Moon. She was a former NPR correspondent, and she just has this really great way of kind of giving you the lay of the land. The other book that so many of my subjects, I'm so curious if both of you read Starhawk's book, The Spiral Dance, that so many people pointed me to that book. And honestly, it wasn't until I read it that the idea of magic clicked for me. And I talk about this a lot, but it was so meaningful to me because magic, this idea of magic was kind of where I was like, wait a second, like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a broom flying across the room? Like, what does that mean? And she is citing another witch by the name of Dion Fortune when she defines it as the art of changing consciousness at will. And that idea really stuck with me. It feels like something it feels familiar, right? It feels like meditation. It feels like having a cup of coffee or a drink, exercise, whatever we're all doing on any given day to sort of change our consciousness. And obviously it's doing it with a lot more intention. But so The Spiral Dance by Starhawk, her portrait is also up at the gallery. So that would be my book to go to. But you two both own stores that sell books. So please take it away, Erica.
Okay, well, I have to recommend my own book, which is called House Magic, Transform Your Home with Witchcraft, but also because it's not just about your home. There's definitely like a very good like DIY primer stuff in there that can, you can use for all sorts of different things. Definitely like the books that we sell, we curate our collection really super tightly. So there's not a ton of books there, but they're the really, really good ones. And if you're more interested in Salem Witch Trial stuff, Tituba was the only person probably like practicing magic as we think of it. in the Salem Witch Trials. And so we have an incredible book called I Teach You Brother, which is channeled actually. And it's completely incredible. Other books for me, Witch Craze by Amuel and Barstow, which really helps to contextualize all of this kind of stuff in the historical and the European witch trials. And that was a huge, like for me, because obviously feminism is a huge core to my interest in witches. And so that one for me was really transformative without necessarily being a spiritual book. Missing Witches, which is a book that we carry as well, is like super incredible. Ariel Gore's Hexing the Patriarchy, which is a spell book of all different social justice and activism related spells. I would recommend any and all of those. And again, the House Witch community page, housewitch.com or housewitchstore.com/community page has, if you are looking to just dabble, like I said, tons of content that's totally free.
Neat. I also have a book coming out, if we're talking about best witch books of the year, that's coming out. And actually Frances partnered with me on this book, so I can't not talk about it here. It's a magical cookbook coming out from Watkins Press later this month. It's hitting the US November 30th, called The Witch's Feast. So if you're, it's kind of an introduction to culinary magic and also magical praxis in general. We got a lot of cool stuff in there. I won't go on about it too much. Definitely check that one out though, because it's gonna be a good one. But as far as useful magical books go, my first one was from Lon Milo Duquette, who's a ceremonial magician within the Thelemic tradition. And it's a book called Homemade Magic, magic with a CK. And it's a great, like, informal but thorough primer on magical praxis. Like, how does it work? How do we make our first set of magical tools? How do you figure out what it is that you believe? Great book for that kind of stuff. I sort of make my home in what a lot of people call traditional witchcraft, even though that's a murky term, like all the murky terms we've been talking about tonight. So I really like the book Besom, Stang, and Sword. I forget who the author is on that. But it's a great one. Also, all books by Laura Tempest Zarkoff. She's an incredible author, has been very prolific. She put out Sigil Witchery. She put out Weaving the Liminal. Those are great. For an introduction to spirit work, there's Mallory Vaudoise's Honoring Your Ancestors. I also particularly like all the folklore books that Corinne Boyer has written. So Under the Bramble Arch, Under the Witching Tree, great introductions to folk magic and some of the charms therein. I tend to err towards authors who are a little bit more on the history side of things. So I could just keep going because I'm a bookshop owner. And so that's all I have is book recommendations. You know, I love almost all of what Daniel Schulke has written. In particular, Beneficium, his Poison Path book is really, really great. And I don't know. I mean, this is what I do all day. There's so many great books out there. It's sorting through sort of the raff and the fraudulent stuff. It's hard to find good education, but there is plenty of it out there if you know where to look. And just to do like last little bit of self promo, if you guys are interested in looking at occult books and taking a look at some that have been sourced by my partner and myself, catlandbooks.com has our full inventory now. You can take a look at what's in stock. We just got a bunch of brand new books in that we're really, really excited about. So if you're looking for first books to start your journey, I don't know, check it out, see what we have to offer. But that's it for me.
That was amazing. Thank you both. That was so incredibly generous of you to share your books and your inspirations. And please, I think everybody run, don't walk to House Witch and Catlands. We are complete with our hour of this program. It went by way too fast. I could just listen to this all day. But I just want to extend a sincere thank you and gratitude to Frances and Erica and Melissa, as well as Beth and Mark, who are also on the PEM team, who helped organize this program. And thank you everybody who attended. We have over 135 people still on this Zoom call, which is absolutely amazing. Please come see the exhibition. It's open until March 22nd. And we just wish everybody a wonderful rest of your evening.